Okay, the title and the thumbnail of this video may be a little clickbaity, because when I decide to sell a module, it's not necessarily because it's a bad module. It just means it didn't work for me as an individual on this journey. So let's keep that in mind as I lay out my 2022 toilet bowl stinkers, the bottom 5 modules on my modular journey. When you have acquired as many Eurorack modules as I have over the course of nearly 3 years, you are bound to run into at least a few that are real stinkers, smoldering turds even, and like all turds, they need to be flushed. In this video, I will reflect on the many modules I found utterly useless to my specific needs, or modules that were so complex they required a PhD in astrophysics to use. It is important that I state up front that these are my opinions and in no way should be taken as fact, or as a deterrent for you to try any of these modules or brands yourself. I'm simply stating here what did not work for me and why, and this is why they were ultimately sold. All of these stinkers are long gone as of this recording, so I cannot demonstrate why they are stinkers except to reflect on their modular journey episodes, where they clearly frustrated the hell out of me. I started this by asking myself, what do I never use, or what is impossible to use, or what sounds like crap? So here is my 2022 list in no particular order. First up, we have the Endorphin's Milky Way. The effects are bland. Not horrible, but nothing I find useful except one reverb and a ping-ponger. I tried to love Milky Way, however after extensive use during Season 2 episodes, I find the only effect I'm using is the ping-pong delay, which is not even easy to tune, or the hall reverb, which just lacks warmth and space. I found the long press for secondary options rarely worked, and I would end up changing the feedback usually, and the secondary functions rarely added anything of value. And the spring reverb sounds god-awful, but I guess that's just what spring reverb sounds like. And when you'd long press to get to the spring reverb's secondary options, the strike the reverb spring would happen, totally throwing off the enjoyable immersion of the piece. Other modules are far superior, even 2HP verb, which is just a stinking reverb. The resetting the stereo width randomly was infuriating, although I of course blame the human for not remembering to check it at every startup. Because other modules do not reset their parameters at power off, I forgot to check the stereo field on power up with the Milky Way, and I would wind up doing 90 minutes of recordings and demos before I realized it was panned to the center. For fuck's sake, really? The same goes for Golden Master and its stereo width per band, though that was not as noticeable or annoying. 75% of the effects provided are really not good compared to similarly priced modules like the Disting Mark IV or a couple of Pico DSPs, for example. The thing I liked about Milky Way is the $209 price point. I like the small size at 6 HP, and I like the clever use of LEDs to tell you where you're at, even though this does rely on the user not having visual issues. Kind of like fuchsia mode, because who uses fuchsia ever? It's kind of beautiful. However, I really dislike the content of the Endorphins manuals. The way they are written, it's like a dog whistle to the dark goth death lovers of the world. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I personally have a real problem with promoting death as anything more than a bad thing, not to be encouraged. Suicide is rampant. We're losing loved ones left and right, and to see a company celebrating death throughout their documentation as a quippy, funny thing is actually disturbing to me. But that's just my opinion, like it or not, more on this later. Next up, the Endorphin's Golden Master. What exactly does that mean? Golden Master. More like Golden Hisser. I was pretty excited to get those bass boosts and cut some of the harshness for the mids using these EQs, but in the end I almost found no use for an in-the-box compressor due to the fact that I am not a live performer, and honestly I just don't need that option. I tried it, I got some use out of it, and now I'm done with it. Other issues with it were I do a lot of talking in demo videos, and the moment my audio stops, the Golden Master sits there hissing loudly for 2 seconds while compressors calm down, which is even when the compressors are not turned on, so I have no idea what's going on there. While at first it seemed like a neat option, stereo width on the 3 bands individually stopped making sense pretty quick. I could see panning the low band to the center a la kicks and basses and maybe widening the high band, but the fact that these settings seem to unset every power down or every other power down, it was very inconsistent, and it was just not worth remembering to fix all those Endorphin stereo width options across the 3 modules. Up next is the Endorphin's Queen of Pentacles drum synthesizer. I should not have purchased this overly expensive one-dimensional device. I never even bothered making an episode of this because it was sold immediately. Queen of Pentacles is a 909 inspired drum module with 3 analog and 4 sample-based sound sources. I should have read that part a little bit more closely. I do not want to trash Queen of Pentacles because as a Eurorack module all by itself, it is actually pretty amazing what it can do and its versatility. I personally have some issues with Endorphin's gear that I will reluctantly cover now. The negatives that caused me to sell Queen of Pentacles almost immediately was specifically tuned to EDM and techno. Where was this descriptor when I was researching? I actually watched dozens of videos on Queen of Pentacles which were in fact mostly EDM and techno, though I assumed incorrectly that I could replace those sounds with custom samples and use the device as a sample player ×7 instead of merely ×4. I will get zero use out of analog hand claps, though I could find a use for bass and snare 909 analog emulations, tuned to be less techno and more rock, maybe put through a filter or two, maybe saturated with some FX, or I could just stop wasting my time making a square peg fit into a round hole and just try something else like the 1010 Bitbox Mark II. Queen of Pentacles also comes with a Milky Way built in for effects processing, so you can guess what I think about that. I am positive that if I spent enough time finding 4 sample-based drum sounds that I wanted to use, that I could find some use for this, but I did not understand what the 3 analog-based drums meant, and completely glazed over the comparison to the TR-909, which is just not my genre of drum machine. I do not EDM, trance, dance, or lo-fi chill beats. It's just not my goal. So while Queen of Pentacles is in fact an amazing module as a drum synth, it just simply was not for me. So I do want to pause once again to remind anybody watching this and typing nasty comments right now that these are not terrible modules at all. None of this Endorphin stuff is terrible. They were just not working for me, so I opted to sell them to try something else. My personal opinion of Endorphin's manuals is not against the actual modules themselves, but the humans that think death is a thing to be ironic about. So let's talk about that real quick before I move on. I've been weirded out since day one about the Endorphin's manuals and their content. RTFM indeed, but what's with the weird statements? Stars can't shine without the darkness. Poetic. Welcome to the dark side. I guess that's dark waves? I'm not sure. You will be dead. Being quirky is one thing, but making light of death is another. I feel comfortable in black. Why is that the descriptor of airwaves? I don't know. Everybody has a dark side. Well, that's true. Especially the person authoring this manual. You will have nightmares forever. Indeed, after spending $670 on this one-trick pony. I'm the death. What is up with the death and Endorphins modules? Is this just some kind of dog whistle to goth types? If so, then that just might make sense, otherwise it's kinda creepy as fuck. Next up here, I have a 2-for-1, because they are both Klavis modules. The Quadigy quad envelope generator was not a horrible module. It was just too complex to use when compared to something like the Micro Ornament and Crime Peaked app. I could never dial in a simple ADSR for some reason, and I spent dozens of hours on the interwebs trying to see how others use Quadigy, yet getting none of the same results following their examples precisely. So either I have a bad module or I just suck at following directions. The only time Quadigy did what I expected was when I followed State Azure's patch notes for folding space. Otherwise, I never gained an understanding of this beautiful looking module, and I sold it in 2022. Honorable mention, along with the Klavis Quadigy, is the Klavis Caltrans. I was duped by some YouTuber videos claiming Caltrans was a life-saving module when it came to tuning or whatever. Well, that was a load of horseshit, because if the oscillator is not already in tune, what good is Caltrans going to do? Again, maybe I was using it wrong, backwards, had things wired out of sequence or whatever, but I could never get Caltrans to behave like the other tutorial or review videos demonstrated. That was so frustrating. I didn't even bother to make a video about Caltrans either and sold it at full price mint almost immediately. That is something I rarely do, sell immediately. But I was now to the point where I had enough modules that when something didn't work for me, out the door it went. Move on to the next one. Which brings me nicely to my last stinker of 2022, the Polyend Poly 2. Also a module I never demonstrated on my modular journey due to my never getting it to work one time the way I thought it should work as a MIDI to CV converter. While I was able to get the CV side of things to play, mapping my MIDI controller channels to CV outputs, the gate controls on the Poly 2 were infuriating. Not once was I able to get more than one channel to open or close the gate properly. There were 8 channels, and if I had all 8 hooked up, the CV 1 through 8 would be fine, but the gate 1 would open and close and gates 2 through 8 would just stay open. I updated the firmware, I reset the module, I spent days online trying to find examples of how this was supposed to work, and in the end I tossed it back in its box and it sat there for a year until I sold it in 2022 with the first batch of stinkers. I do want to note that I have seen others get this module working beautifully, especially the Polyphony, which was all I bought it for. I never intended to use a keyboard with modular necessarily, but once I had the Quad VCO by Doepfer, I definitely wanted to try out 4-note polyphonic chords, and sadly to this very day I have yet to succeed in this endeavor, even using the KeyStep Pro, which I bought for this very specific purpose and sold a year later because of the same failures. Take note of the lowest common denominator here. That would be me. While this is supposed to be a bottom 5 stinkers video, I do have to mention one module that is not a stinker at all, but due to firmware bugs I ended up selling it just the same. Farewell to my beloved Instruo looper. For 8 months it was unusable due to a firmware bug that was taking too long to get fixed. I opted to sell the looper in the meanwhile for something I could use today. I did end up with the Bitbox Mark II for playback, but it is not the same animal at all, and I will likely revisit the looper now that the version 2 firmware is stable. For as critical a bug as the looper audio loader was, I was shocked it took Instruo 2 years to fix and release firmware 2, which then, in effect, changed how looper functions in general. Not necessarily for the worse, as the newer firmware does appear to please many. I may one day repurchase Looper because, in my opinion, it is truly a unique, amazing audio recording playback device that theoretically does everything I want it to, but I just could not use it with the version 1.x bugs. So that's it for the 2022 bottom 5 list plus Looper. And of course, I need to reiterate that it isn't a hate crime that I have an opinion that doesn't align with yours. I merely found these devices unusable in my situation and opted to get rid of them and try something else. All of the modules mentioned here, even the Endorphin stuff that I genuinely disliked, serve a purpose to those who desire that exact sound or functionality, which is what it all comes down to, using the tools we love to create the sounds we love. Now go out there and create something you love. And if you do not love the sound, ask yourself why. Then flush those turds.